Hi guys! Today I'm going to talk to you about Arteza gouache. I bought this set about half a year ago and I haven't used it that much yet. This is supposed to be a beginner's guide, and it's going to be a beginner's guide in more than one way. It is not only meant for beginners, it's also done by a beginner. I'm pretty much a beginner with gouache, and I've only painted about 10-11 paintings with it. So this is really just somewhat of a first impressions type thing. I've learned a few things about gouache, and I thought I would share these experiences because I had to search the internet all over for information about gouache, and I watched many videos, and most of the videos I found were all done by people who were way too experienced for me to understand what they were going on about. So I thought I would like to share some of the experiences that I've had with gouache, and maybe that will help some other beginners to figure out some stuff that I found truly confusing with gouache. In this video, I will not only talk about the Arteza gouache paints that I've shown you, but also about what palette I'm using and why, and also the brushes that I'm using. Here you see me swatching out the colors, and I've done that before in my sketchbook, but I haven't actually done a proper swatch sheet yet, so I'm trying to rectify that situation. The colors are generally very vibrant, and the selection is quite good for mixing. It's actually not quite accurate that I hadn't used gouache before. I had to use some form of gouache in school. It was something in between gouache and poster paint, and I was very, very bad at it. The reason for that was mainly that the gouache we had to use was of rather poor quality, and the selection of the colors didn't really make for a good mixing combination. Everything just seemed to turn into mud. Also, these paints were not really opaque, even though it said on the tin that they were. Generally speaking, the Arteza paints are more opaque than the colors I used in school. Apart from white gouache, I haven't really tried any other gouache brands before, so I don't really have a comparison between the Arteza colors and any other brands apart from for the white. I personally prefer the white of Schmincke, but it is okay. Expect to be running out of the white quickest because you will use that in pretty much every painting, and then you might as well buy a more expensive white to improve the quality. Opacity will always be a problem, and the white will be always the one that should be more opaque. This was one of the things that confused me at first, because gouache is supposed to be opaque, but it isn't really always. Sometimes you have to go in with several layers before it really becomes opaque. One trick to make pure gouache colors more opaque is to add a little bit of white. That might sound a little counterintuitive since I said that the white gouache is always the one that you wish would be more opaque, but combined with other colors it becomes more opaque. You can actually make gouache by adding white gouache to your watercolors. This might be a good option if you decide on buying a more expensive set of gouache paints, which might have a smaller selection of colors to choose from. This is normally what I recommend for watercolors, because the quality really makes a difference. With gouache, I have to say, it's probably better to go with a cheaper option first. And the reason for this is mainly that gouache is very, very frustrating. And you might not want to continue using it after a few attempts. Gouache has a few quirks that are just very, very confusing. For example, it dries down differently from what you put down wet. The darker colors dry down lighter, and the lighter colors dry down darker. So sometimes it's really, really difficult to judge the actual color and value of the paint you're putting down. Also, overpainting things can be surprisingly difficult. You can't really glaze like in watercolors because you're going to lift the gouache off the paper. In general, if you use too much water, then whatever layer is below the layer you're attempting to paint might lift, and then all your hard work will be for nothing. And if you're going over it with a different color, it might mix with the layers below if you use too much water. This is exactly what happened to me in my very first attempt with gouache, and it was sort of traumatizing, and I didn't attempt gouache again for quite a while after that. I recorded a little demo that shows you exactly how that went down. And since gouache can be so confusing and so frustrating, there's always a period in the middle of the painting where it just looks like it's not going to work out, and you will feel that you don't want to continue and you don't even know why you're doing this to yourself, and so on and so forth. So, starting with gouache can be very difficult. The only advice I can give you for this problem is to simply continue even when you want to give up. Usually the painting comes together in the end, and you're gonna be grateful that you didn't give up on it. That said, of the paintings that I've done so far, I've only liked 3, and there were about 11 or 12, so it's difficult in the beginning. It might also be that whatever you're trying to paint would actually benefit from another medium. Sometimes whatever you're painting needs a more flowy style, like with watercolor, and gouache doesn't do that even when you water it down. When you water down gouache, it still will just sit on the paper because of the binder. It will not flow like watercolor. Although you can blend out gouache with a lot of care and patience, you might still need a medium that blends a little more easily. So depending on your style, gouache might not actually be for you. And that's okay too. Personally, I like to use gouache for landscape studies. And this is also what I chose as a demo for this review. I really enjoy making small landscape studies, and with gouache I can sometimes fix little mistakes that I wouldn't be able to fix with watercolors. So I prefer to make my first little study with gouache and then maybe do another one with watercolors if I feel so inclined. The reason why I found gouache so frustrating myself is because I was trying to use it the gouache way, whatever that is, and didn't really want to use it in a watercolor way. But in the end, I realized that I can just work from lighter to darker like in watercolors, and that's perfectly fine for this medium. The only thing I need to remember is to work from thin to thick, because if I use too much water later on, it's gonna lift everything I've done before. This is why I normally go in a very flowy, watery first layer and then work up to thicker layers later on. I usually don't even make a sketch in pencil, I just go in with the gouache right away and go from there because I can always overpaint it. So, although I use gouache in a rather watercolory way, I still can't really use my watercolor brushes for it. The reason for that is that Arteza gouache crumbles when it dries. You have to work it when you re-wet it, and it doesn't re-wet very well. I really don't want to stab my good brushes at a chunk of gouache and ruin them that way. So the brushes I use are synthetic brushes, and they are a little bit stronger than normal watercolor brushes, I would say. Something like DaVinci Forte or Escoda Barocco or something like that. Arteza gouache isn't the only gouache that cracks when it dries, so drying them in a palette is not such a great idea. If you really must use it out of a palette, I would suggest that you get a gouache palette that is already dry to begin with. With brands that come in tubes, I would suggest just getting out enough paint for the painting you're intending to do, and leave it at that. You can still re-wet whatever you have on the palette, but you will notice that it doesn't re-wet quite as opaquely as when it comes directly from the tube. I tend to re-wet whatever I have on the palette for the first initial layer of my next gouache painting, and then overpaint it with fresh gouache. The last piece of advice that I want to share is that use a little bit more water when you're trying to paint opaquely. At least more water than you think. Don't just use it out of the tube, because that's gonna get very, very frustrating very, very quickly. It just becomes a little bit too thick to handle, even for the stronger synthetic brushes that I use. Surprisingly, even though I am still a beginner, I had quite a bit of advice to share, and I hope that maybe this will help you a little bit. Although I don't really have a comparison with more expensive gouache paints, I have to say I have a comparison to cheaper paints, and Arteza is quite alright. Basically, I couldn't really work at all with the really cheap paints, and with Arteza, I'm getting somewhere. I would say it is at least a better student quality brand. The packaging provides pigment information and even light fastness information, which is rare with student brands, and I have to say I enjoyed the paints so far. Any frustrations I would have had with more expensive gouache too, because it's just simply a difficult medium to learn. It's also quite cheap. I have to say that when I bought the set of Arteza gouache, I actually wanted to simply buy a gouache white, and all the more expensive brands were almost as expensive for one tube as Arteza is for a whole pack of paints. It was definitely a good way to get into the medium, and when I run out of single colors, I can replace them with more expensive brands. I will definitely continue using these paints, and even though gouache is quite a frustrating medium, I have also had some successes with it already. The painting I'm sharing with you today did go rather well, I have to say. The sky was rather ambitious for a gouache painting, and it probably would have turned out better in watercolors because it would have been a lot more flowy and the blending would have been much easier with wet and wet. But I still like the way it turned out, and I could intensify the white a little bit more this way and didn't have to worry about protecting the highlights at all. I didn't have to paint around details or protect details with masking fluid, which always seems to go wrong when I use it. So it is a good method when you just want to paint and not think too much about the planning of a painting. This definitely makes it a good medium for studies, because you don't have to plan everything out and you can change things up, even if you have to be a bit more careful than maybe with other opaque mediums like acrylic or acrylic gouache. Speaking of acrylic gouache, if you run into a lot of problems with lifting paint from previous layers, then you might want to think about investing in acrylic gouache instead of regular gouache. Acrylic gouache doesn't reactivate or lift, which means that you can just paint over previous layers without worrying about anything going wrong. Basically, all my frustrations with regular gouache don't even exist with acrylic gouache. However, since gouache dries very quickly, acrylic gouache might lead to a lot of paint waste if you don't use a stay wet palette. Personally, I'm using simply a metal palette, and I picked the biggest one I could find, because with gouache I always seem to run out of mixing space. You don't really need a dedicated palette though. You can simply take a porcelain dish or something like that. Since regular gouache reactivates, cleanup is very easy. And that might be one reason why you would want to choose gouache over something like acrylic paint if you're using that already. In any case, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give this video a like and maybe subscribe to my channel, since there will be more art videos coming soon. Also, if you have any further questions or any advice on gouache to share, then please leave a comment below. So, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon for another video. Bye!